Hello everybody and welcome back. In this video we're going to be doing a project breakdown of this render I have here. And I made this render about 2 years ago and I called it fruit salad because it kind of looks like I'm preparing a fruit salad. That's kind of like the setup we have going here. And this is going to be the very first video in a series of project breakdown videos that I'm going to be doing for the future. Now, because I've never done a project breakdown video before in the course, I am going to take a little bit of time on this one explaining what exactly the difference is between a project breakdown video and some of the actual just plain project videos we've already done in the course so far. Now, over here, let's just make an example. This side here is our project videos. We've been working on them. And then over here, this is our new project breakdown videos. Now, a project video is where we actually start from scratch, or relatively from scratch. We started with almost nothing in the scene, and we worked, and I walked you through every single step of the process and how to make it. That includes pulling out every individual node, starting with a blank material, building every single thing up, and of course moving and hand placing assets. For example, if this was a project video, just a regular project video, I would show you how to hand place each individual fruit element, how to bring out the blank object mesh and then put on the textures and texture it and do all of that. Now this is really great for intermediate to semi-advanced users or even non-advanced users. This is really great because I kind of hold your hand a little bit and walk you through and get you a really good idea of workflow and technique and just all the tiny little intricate details that go into understanding and using Octane, and just a little bit more background and kind of how I work. Now, this said, for more advanced users, you might be like, okay, I already know how to pull out an RGB spectrum node. I've already done this hundreds of times over. At that point, it's just kind of wasting time, right? You've spent so much time seeing these same things over and over again. It'd be nice to speed things up a little bit, and that is exactly what the project breakdown videos are for. These are going to be videos for the whole scene. Everything you see here in rendered is already going to be set up. It's already going to be done. What we're going to be going through is dissecting and looking at each individual element that makes up our scene. For example, we'll take a look at this pre-rendered, already set up material set up for this orange in Octane. Open up that material and see what I did and how to texture it. This means we're going to be spending less time looking at the tiny little details of more simpler topics, such as moving or just building the node and just doing the regular things like pulling out an image texture node, loading in the image, and then plugging it in. Instead of doing all that, we'll take a look. We already know how to do that. We're just going to see, okay, what particular techniques did I do very special for handling this problem of creating a realistic orange or a realistic slice for pineapple, or how did I texture a pineapple when it didn't have a slice, or how did I texture it when I had half of a pineapple? How did I go around handling these specific little texturing scenarios? So the point being is that a project breakdown video is meant for advanced users, much more for advanced users, because we're going to spend less time on simpler topics and more time focusing specifically on the high-end details of putting a scene and rendering it out. We're going to be focusing mainly on the difficult problems and aspects I might have bumped into in this render and how I accomplish them, the high-end advanced knowledge that advanced users would want to kind of see. So the big real key takeaway from a project breakdown video is we're going to be able to cover much more advanced Octane information in less time, because we're simply just going to be dissecting what's already been set up, and we'll skip a lot of the more simple steps, such as showing you how to pull out an RGB spectrum node or something like that, because at this point in the course I feel like you should have a good understanding of that. If you ever feel like this is just too overwhelming and you feel like, oh my goodness, he's talking about all these different things, I don't know what's going on, how did he get this node, how does this work? Don't worry. Go back and go through the project videos or other videos in the course that explain each individual topic, and that will answer your question. So if you're feeling overwhelmed in these videos, that's okay. Just simply go back and go through the project videos first. I already assume that you've gone through all the project videos that I have before you're watching these, so I just want to make sure you're aware of that. With all of this out of the way, let's go ahead and dive in. I'm sorry I spent so much time on the intro. I did just want to make sure that we all were on the same page with that. So to begin, let's go ahead and start taking this apart. Now, this is actually one of a series of renders I've done of this scene. Now, first thing I want to mention is the scene layout. What did I make? Where did I get the assets? What's mine? What did I make myself? And what did I bring in via third party? This cutting board we have here on the ground, this is something I modeled by hand. It was super, super easy. All it is a little boxy kind of cube that I stretched out, cut a few holes in here in the top, or just one hole, and then put those together and put it in a subdivision surface. Cleaned it up. We'll talk about this more. This I did make myself. The material I actually brought in from Octane Live DB, and I just did a flat projection on top of that, so that was also easy. Now, all of these fruit assets, I'm sure everybody's wondering, where did you get these? These are actually from a website called Blank Repository. Now, this is something I want to mention now because it's very important. When I made this was over 2 years ago. The Blank Repository was giving these assets out for free. That's right. The oranges, the slices, all of this was made exclusively from those free assets. Now, that means, sadly, is right now, those assets are no longer available, I'm afraid. Because this was so long ago, their store was experimenting with different ideas and options, and I'm afraid right now, I've checked their site, they do no longer provide any of these assets. In fact, you can't even buy them anymore. You have to email Blank Repository directly to get them. So I want to make sure you're aware of that as well. You're not going to be able to follow along 100% to the T here. This is more a learning example video. You're just going to be going through here not to follow along, but just to learn from what I did, some of the mistakes I made, learn from them in here, and also see some of the issues I ran into and see how I fixed them, kind of learn from my own fixes, what I learned. Basically me sharing, I ran into a problem, here's how I fixed it, and then sharing that fix with you guys. So that also has me really excited for these project breakdown videos, because I'm really going to be able to take a lot of these cool scenes that I've made so far and really share how I put them together. So it'll be really fun, I think, to kind of share that with you guys. But all this said, we're not going to be able to follow along exactly to T like I was saying, but that said, still a lot of information to pull from here. Now, this said, these assets that I did get from Blank Repository were very, very simple. I mean, they were a raw mesh, tons of geometry. Nothing was retopologized, and the image textures were all in 8K, I believe, and also their UV maps were a mess. It was like literally right out of the 3D scanning program and just dumped for everybody to use. So again, they were free though, so I'm not complaining. I'm just saying they were less than perfect, so I did have to do a lot of work to rework them. All I came up with was a diffuse albedo map that I basically worked with from there. But before we move on, the knife I got here was just a preset default Cinema 4D knife that they have in the kitchen section. I think under Cinema 4D Broadcast or Studio folder. I forget which one. I retextured it. Basically, all it was just metal for the handle and the blade, and I used some Cinema 4D, Octane noise to add some little bit of bumps and details here on the handle, and a little bit of stretched noise based off of a projection to kind of give the blade a little bit more detail there too. But again, with this out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the other renders. I'm going to hop over. This is a close-up shot. This is actually zoomed in on these slices here, these two orange slices, or two pineapple slices, which the orange slice there. You can see really cool. We get some of the bump map detail here. This could have been higher resolution. Again, 2 years ago. I've made some progress since then, thankfully. So there's definitely some things here that could have been improved on, which we'll also talk about that as well. If we go over, this is a very iconic piece here that a lot of people have liked. I thank you so much for your for the nice words that you've said. If you happen to have seen this and have mentioned to me, I thank everybody who has said that. Really do appreciate it. Again, this is a really good, I'm really happy with how this part here turned out. Really good lighting and all that. And the bump map that we used on our orange slices, originally starting with the albedo texture here, and how we've reworked that to really get some of this to pop, really did add a lot of life to this orange slice. And at that point, that is it. All I have is just some blank, diffuse, clay rendered versions of this, just kind of showing what I textured and what was the default. So with this out of the way, let's go ahead and close this and hop in to our scene here. And here it is. This is the scene. It's already rendering in the background, and you can see that this is literally all it is. I have this default kind of floor here. I guess we could talk about the floor first off. I'm just going to go ahead and select that. On the floor in my selection isn't selecting up. There it is. I got to go back to object mode. Here's our plane. I'm going to go ahead and select our material for our floor, go over to the node editor, and this is nothing special. This is a free wood material that I got off of a website. This is an extra node we don't need. I forget exactly where I got this. I'm sure one of you guys out there seeing this might remember, but it was just a default kind of a nice wood texture I got. It was a free one. I think it was part of a V-Ray texture pack. Right now, I probably would use some different wood textures. I have a series through the Texture Haven Octane material pack that I have set up. I'd probably use something through there because they have some really good stuff. But anyway, that's what it was. All it is, default, diffuse, specular, roughness, normal. Nothing going on special here. Everything is set default for the gamma and power. I don't see anything special going on here. And for my index, I believe we just have 1.45. And this is just simply a glossy material. So that is the reflections we're getting for the floor. Again, nothing very special going on here at all. Next off, let's go ahead and take a look at the cutting board. I'm just going to go over here, take our knife and a few other of our instances and assets here and just disable them so we can focus on the cutting board. Nothing very special for our cutting board here. If we go ahead and select it, we have our cutting board. And what I've done, I'm going to disable everything except for the very base of it. As you can see, this is it here. This is essentially the raw geometry. I'll do the shortcut N plus B to just take a look at that. This is the raw geometry. Very, very simple. I mean, it doesn't get simpler than this, basically. I mean, we're less than 50 polygons probably for the whole thing because I was only half of it. And then what I did is I threw this simple little model into a symmetry, which symmetrized it, if that's a word, I think, made it symmetrical on both sides. And then I threw that into a subdivision surface, and then that smoothed it out. Now, on top of that, while it was before I put it in a symmetry object, I also threw a bevel deformer underneath of that. So this was the default here, actually. It was even simpler than that. And then I just threw this bevel deformer right on there. Boom, add a little bit of bevel just to smooth out the edges a little bit. I really like that because with the bevel deformer off, it just made the edges a little too round, a little less pronounced. The bevel deformer just kind of gave a little bit more pronounced kind of hit to that. Now, as far as the texturing went on here, I went super, super easy. All I did, let's go ahead and take a look at our material here. That would be this material here. This, if I go to our node editor, this is, again, a preset that I downloaded from the Octane Live DB. Nothing special. Again, it's just a diffuse, specular, roughness, bump, and displacement. Nothing special going on here. What the material came with is it came with a diffuse, specular, roughness, and a displacement map, which was super nice. Now, this is actually my bump map. Here's my displacement map. And I also, apparently, this is interesting, back when I got this, this was only a 2K image texture, because again, I downloaded from the Octane Live DB, so everything on through there isn't exactly always top quality, but there is some really good stuff there. Like, don't get me wrong, there's some beautiful hidden gems sometimes in there too. But they're all usually, they're all free to download, so I mean, you get what you pay for too. This said they're not all 100% royalty free, so be aware when you're going through. Check that it's royalty free if you're using it for commercial projects. Usually this was a personal project, so I wasn't afraid of that, but I just want to make sure you're aware of that. But what I did is actually took the roughness map and mixed that with a displacement node and made the roughness and the displacement the same. I could have used the bump, but for some reason here, particularly the roughness just had better results. I just like the way the roughness looked. It had something a little bit more defined, which if you look through here, it's kind of hard to see, but you can see this is a little softer. If I kind of pull this out more, possibly, kind of doesn't really make it bigger. The roughness map is more contrasty, whereas the displacement map is not, or sorry, the bump map. Now for my bump, what I did is, because I didn't want my bump so strong, I actually dropped this down to 0.035. If I set this to default of 1, it's a mess. It's horrible. It's just way too strong. This material wasn't necessarily meant to use like I did. I would actually probably use some better materials if I were to do this again from the Texture Haven Octane material pack. I definitely would, but again, this was like 2 years ago, and I was just kind of working with what I had there. So again, this is way too strong, right? I wanted a softer result. So again, 0.035 is what I used before, and that is just a really nice, kind of softer, more smooth board. And this gives some pretty good results here. And a lot of that detail along the grain of the wood here and the reflections, that is coming from our displacement map. So if I unplug our displacement, boom, you can see we lose a lot of that detail. It flattens out very hard right there. But if I plug our displacement back in, it'll take a moment to load up because it is very high, pretty decent high quality displacement. And as soon as that loads in there we go. We have a little bit more of this nice type of detail, just kind of bringing some life to this here. Now, again, the problem was, too, this is only 2K, so that is another drawback with this particular render. But that said, working with what I had, I would definitely, moving forward, have used at least a 4K render, especially for something this close, because this particular shot that I had here particularly could see the faults with that low resolution here. You could really see that kind of the stutter stepping and stuff, and just kind of pixelation. Not quite what I was looking for, especially here too. This really shows it. This here just shows how low resolution this is. For this level of zoom that we're applying on it, 2K is just not holding up. That said, though, still pretty good. The other thing I wanted to mention is I actually upped the gamma on my image texture here for the diffuse. It's actually at 4.45. The reason I did this is because the default 2.2, this is what the material was supposed to look like, and it was just too light. The wood was just not dark enough for what I wanted, and I could drop it lower, make it even lighter, but I wanted a really kind of dark, gritty wood, and 4.45 just did that perfectly for me. This was just much darker. It just had a better effect, and you can see with these renders that this, I felt like it was a really great contrast to the brighter fruit that we had on top of it. It's just something a little bit more gritty, a little bit darker. Just I really added to the look I was going for on the scene. Now that we have all that there's really nothing too special. I will mention that this is a glossy material. Literally, that's all it is. It's just a glossy material with a diffuse specular roughness, bump and displacement. Nothing really special going on here. Of course, we have a texture projection node set to mesh UV. I don't know really why I hooked that up, because there's nothing going on with that. And then multiple transform nodes. I could have controlled these all under one, but I wasn't as efficient back then, and I just had one for each individual. It would have been better just having them all hooked up to one mega transform node that would just plug into each individual one, so I could control them all from one of them. So I could remove these and just have this one plugged into everyone. But again, that's something I would do moving forward if I were to do this again. The next thing I want to talk about is the projection and how I actually projection map this on here. Because you notice underneath our node editor that if I go to texture projection node, it's set to mesh UV. So I'm actually not doing any Octane projection for the material in here. This is entirely being done off of Cinema 4D's UV map, or whatever Cinema 4D is actually set to project it as. And if we go ahead and select the material here, we can see that we're actually using a flat projection. And if I go to our texture mode here, if I select this, you can actually see that this is kind of how it's been projected. It's been projected in a somewhat flat way, kind of messy actually. You can see here, it's kind of like it's flat, but then also kind of curved weirdly. If I uncheck our world selection here, you can see it's kind of like off at a weird angle. I might have done this out of being just kind of sloppy, or I might have had a purpose for this. I'm trying to really remember. For me, I think it's just being lazy and sloppy. But my point is that I wanted to have a flat projection. It was very distinct in the look I wanted for this. I wanted the wood grains to go off in this angle, and it by default, if we go ahead to our coordinates here, all I have to do is select our material, go to coordinates, and I'm just going to right-click these and center them back out. Right-click our rotations. And you can see by default, the rotation it's placed up in the air. And it's kind of vertical. And this is kind of bugging out our material. So we're just going to go ahead and rotate this a little bit, like say 8 degrees. And you can see here that this just puts a really kind of weird flat projection on it. It looks kind of interesting, but we want is something flat. So let's go ahead and type in on our P there for our pitch. We're going to type in 90, and this will give us a perfect 90-degree flat projection that hits right from the top and works its way down. Now the drawback of this is on the edge, we're projecting from the top down, but you can see right here in the center, this is where it's going to start to essentially mirror itself. So you can see we go from here and then to the other side, and you can see that it's not tileable. You can see here that we're getting like these little seams here that are showing up because it's not particularly a tileable texture when projected that way, or it could just be some of the Phong normal having an issue there. That's another possibility. But again, this is kind of a sloppy texture projection of it, but I did this because from the angle and the way I had it set up, it wasn't really a big deal. It kind of worked perfectly. And it was very important for me that I have like a nice kind of 45-degree angle of rotation. So if I type in -45, that's going to give a nice 45-degree angle of rotation for this texture that really lets this wood kind of just wrap off at an angle. And for me, this was a lot better than having it go off at just a perfect 90 or just a flat 0-degree rotation. Because for me, this just did not go for the look that I was wanting. I really wanted the wood to kind of come from an angle. I wanted it to run in that angle. It just really kind of fit what I was going for. And it also really is neat that the wood is actually lined up perfectly in grain with the camera, but even though the board is at an angle, I just thought it brought some visual interest to it. It was the look I was going for. The next thing I want to mention too is that this, of course, was done with Cinema 4D, not Octane. The reason for this is I could have done it with Octane, but it just felt easier to visualize the Cinema 4D projection because I can just literally grab it and then just rotate it just by eye, just kind of get an idea what's it look like, where is it rotating from, etc. Now, I could actually press W, pull this up and down, and it won't have an effect because we're just flat projecting it. But that said, I do have the full position-based movement here. So I can move this around and adjust these, and it just felt a whole lot easier to kind of adjust these. Of course, back then, I wasn't as comfortable using the node editor inside of Octane, so I could have just gone to texture projection, switch this to frontal, or perspective, that said, or I could have done box, tons of other different projections, XYV to UVW, many other different ways I could have gone about this. For example, we could have just done this from perspective, and then we could have altered that perspective based off of an object. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. What we could have done is we could have created a camera, hopped in this camera, went over here, drug the camera into the external perspective thing here, and now wherever our camera is looking is where it's going to project from. As you can see, I zoom in, I can move around, and we have that perspective projection lining up with that. And then I could hop out of this camera, and instantly you can see we have that same type of projection going on. For me personally, instead of doing all that work, we're basing it off of a camera, and I could go back to W, go to object mode, and move the camera around. You can see now that this is actually moving. So pretty cool. Same result, just as possible with Octane. I'm going to go ahead and remove that. I wanted to use Cinema 4D because it was particularly easier in this particular instance. So let's go back to Mesh UV here to get that back to the Cinema 4D projection we had. And again, both ways are possible. This is just what I did in this particular instance, just for personal reasons, feeling like it was easier. But basically, now that we have that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at our next set. What do I want to talk about next? I think what I want to talk about is just my camera layout. I'm going to unhide all our geometry in the scene. I have my knife, geo instances, raw geo, etc. While we're doing this, we should probably mention a little bit what we have in the scene. We've already done a bit, but we have our cutting board, we have our plane, that's our floor, we have an Octane sky that's lighting our environment. I do want to make sure I talk about that actually. Then we have raw geo, geo instance, and knife. Now, raw geo is the raw geometric objects that I have in my scene that I got from Blank Repository. These are the fruit scans, and you can see that they are incredibly dense, but very detailed, and they look beautiful, don't they? Rendered in Octane, they just turned out really, really well. But again, this is extremely dense, and these meshes take up a lot of VRAM. We're looking at 3 gigs for this scene, and that's only with these little bit of meshes selected here. We have 5 elements total. Now, because these elements are so dense and just so heavy, just like what we have down here for our pineapple slices, what I did is I actually instanced them using instance geometry inside of Cinema 4D. So what I did is I took all my raw elements and I keep them under a null so I can keep them organized. And then anytime I wanted to have a copy of these, have multiples of them, I would use my geo instances. That's these here, where I just use an instance object, and I would connect that to one of the raw instances down here under the raw geo. And I would store these separately underneath the geo instances, just so I could keep track of them. For example, I can just go ahead and hold down left alt, double click here and hide them, and this represents the entire actual raw geometry that Octane and Cinema 4D are actually loading. Everything else is a fake instance clone of every other element in the scene. For example, we just have one pineapple, one half of a pineapple, one orange slice, and one pineapple slice, or one pineapple little quarter slice here. But if I unhide my instances, these are all the instances. We have all our extra oranges, all our extra pineapples, all our little orange slices. Brings a lot more life to the scene. This was the way that I was actually able to have a lot more high quality looking elements, but at the same time, not have to worry about having too high VRAM, because there is no way Octane would have been able to render this much raw, dense mesh. Like we had been talking about, I mean, my goodness, each element is like a couple million polygons, I'm pretty sure. So we'd be looking at quite a bit. In fact, we can find out right now. If I take my pineapple whole, I just want to find out for the heck of it. We'll select it, do Control A. We're looking at 2,984,000 polys. So 3 million polys per pineapple. You can imagine how quickly that would add up. That's insane. So instancing here was a big deal. Now that we understand that and kind of the placement of that, again, here's the knife instance. This is just the knife that I had, pre-default knife that we get from the Cinema 4D content browser over here. Nothing particularly special here. We have our blade and the handle. The blade, if we disable this, you can see is extremely low poly. Whoever modeled this did a really good job and was super optimized on how they put this together. So we were put some subdivision surface on that. Looks beautiful. For the handle also, that's separate. There's the default mesh, and we go ahead and subdivide that as well. So we'll take a look more about the materials on that later. For now, though, let's start looking at some of the fruit and orange slices. So let's go ahead and disable our geo instances again. We'll just go ahead and hide those, just so we can focus on the raw individual elements. The first one I want to talk about is this pineapple slice, because this is a piece that I'm particularly proud of. I had a pretty good idea when I was texturing this for the first time. I'll do N plus A so we can see the mesh without the lines there. When I was texturing this for the first time, I came up with some really good ideas on how to kind of put this together. So this is what I really want to show you guys. Now, because we have so many different elements and textures in the scene here, I did end up layering my materials. So if I go to my no layer, then we have stuff like the handle, the blade, our floor, and the wood here. But then for each individual fruit, I actually have a layer set up. And the way I did this is I just select, say, a random material, say like this one here. I right click on it, did add to new layer, or add to a current layer, and that would be these here. Now, if I added to a new layer, I can just click this and then name that layer by double-clicking on it and then giving it a name. I'm just going to go ahead, right-click. I don't know how you delete a layer, actually. There's got to be a way to do it. I have to figure that out. But the point is, that's how you create a layer. So what we're going to do is I have them layered for each individual section. We have our quarter. Little pineapple quarter. We have our whole pineapple, our half, our whole orange, and our slice of an orange, and that new layer I made there. Now, let's go ahead and start with the quarter. That's this little pineapple quarter right here. And the way I textured this was actually way back, again, 2 years ago. This was before we had the Octane Universal material. This is before we had the Octane Blend material. This is before we had a lot of these really handy materials. We didn't have a Universal, we didn't have a Metallic, and we didn't even have an Octane Blend material. We didn't have those. All we had was a mixed material. So if I wanted to mix multiple material types together, like say a glossy or a specular with a diffuse, I had to use a mixed material. So this is using that old system. This said the information that we learned from here is still going to be applicable under the new system. So you could easily do the same thing I did here with an Octane Blend material. It's just you would want to use the blend material instead of making two separate diffuse and specular materials like I did here and then throwing them in a mix. Same process, just a little different workflow. So what I did here is, again, I started out with two different materials here. I have a diffuse, that's this, and then I have an actual specular material. The reason I did this is because a pineapple slice is very distinct in how it's made up. The actual kind of meat of the pineapple here, the actual fruit part that you eat, that is something that has a lot of liquid and water in it and is pretty transparent with a lot of subsurface scattering going on. This said, and you can actually see this even more if I would rotate it up. I'm just going to kind of rotate it up and over and lift it in the air. Hopefully a little bit more light will shine through it. And you can see here, look how much more subsurface scattery that looks than if that would have just been a plain diffuse. The problem is the back of it should not look like that. If we did that, the whole back would look like maybe a gummy, entirely gummy, fake, fabricated pineapple slice. That's not what we want, right? This part should be hard. This is like a rough, kind of woody, almost kind of backing that these pineapples have. Something very diffuse, right? It would be like a diffuse material here. Well, what I did is I actually mixed them both and then kind of blended in between both of them. So what I did, essentially, is I took a Octane mix material. We'll go ahead and select that now. Hop up here, and what I did is I actually used a gradient and did a circular projection. I did a radial projection with a sine wave, and with my texture projection, I actually did like a circular gradient on this. Now, to help really make this apparent, I'm going to take our diffuse, because here's our diffuse. Here is our specular, and they're both plugged into this mixed material, and they're being controlled, amount shows up where based off this gradient. And if I go ahead, take our diffuse, for example, and unplug the diffuse, you can see here's the diffuse material, this white part, and then this part here is the actual specular. So it's entirely specular separated from the diffuse. That way, through this gradient I had here, and I can go ahead to our texture projection and scale this a little bit just to show you. I could scale it really low, or I could scale it really high. And you can see that this is how I was able to actually segregate the actual rind from the pineapple from the actual meat or fruity part of the pineapple. And literally, that's all I did. So I took this gradient, I said set this to linear, transform, I left to a 90-degree because if this was 0, it would kind of wrap around this way. So I had to actually up that Y to 90 degrees to rotate it so the circle is kind of wrapping this direction instead of wrapping this way. So instead of kind of wrapping around like that, it wraps around in more of a vertical or a horizontal way. So instead of wrapping in a direction, if I flatten the pineapple out more, it would actually make more sense. Let's see if I can back up enough to flatten that back out. There we go. So before, the projection had the gradient kind of going. If I go back to our node editor and we get rid of the 90-degree transform, we can put in a 0 here, again, unplug our diffuse, and you can see it's kind of wrapping around clockwise, right, from a center point here, wrapping around like this. Well, I don't want that. I want to rotate this gradient 90 degrees on Y, so instead, it's wrapping around it kind of horizontally, based off of like this vertical point here, so it wraps around it kind of like this, so the gradient can come in and out. So that's basically kind of how I did it there. It's always interesting trying to wrap your head around projections and stuff in 3D. But basically imagine the sphere, instead of our sphere being rotated and it wrapping over top of it, it was rotated sideways, so it wraps around it. And that kind of gives a much better result. So if we hop into, we take our sine waves here, into our gradient, you can see we can pull these values forward and backwards, and this gives us this beautiful kind of rotation that we can do through here. Now, what I ended up doing too is I took this gradient and popped it into an invert node. The reason I did this was simply out of laziness and not wanting to have to bother with inverting these, because I could do the same thing. I could just simply switch the black and the white points and it would do the same thing. But because I actually set this up ahead of time and they all worked correctly, it was just like I wanted. It was just switched. I just said, it's easier just to throw an invert on it instead of having to worry about messing with these little nodes here in our gradient. So that's the only reason I did that. Now, as far as actually texturing the diffuse version versus the specular, here's what I did. We'll start with the diffuse and then I'll work our way onto the specular. Let's actually talk about the material editing parts that I did here, besides just separating them. Now, for the rind here, the diffuse element, all I really have going on is, if I can plug in my diffuse element here, again, these were very simple assets. All they came with was a 4K, it wasn't even 8K apparently, 4K diffuse texture. Because again, these were free, you get what you pay for. It was super nice, and look, don't get me wrong, these are incredibly well-made assets, and I'm really thankful to Blank Repository for giving these away for free as long as they did. Sadly, they're not doing it anymore, which is definitely understandable. But anyway, all I got was this, just the diffuse image. So I had to rework it to get some more detail out of it. What did I do? Well, I simply took this diffuse image that I plugged into diffuse. It worked perfectly for that. What I did is I plugged it into a gradient and then added a little bit of contrast. And this gradient gives me this look here. If I slap it on the diffuse, you can kind of see it working. We're getting a little bit of our specular showing through now. It's not particularly showing up that well. I think if I switch over to, what would be a good way to get this to show up? We could go ahead and switch, we'll unplug our amount, and we'll just go ahead and underneath our mixed materials, we'll take our amount and pull it to, I think 1? No, 0. We want to pull it to 0. So it's a pure diffuse, right? A pure diffuse image. And now, for our diffuse, I'm going to take our transmission, because this is our transmission we have here. We'll talk about that in a bit. We'll just unplug it. And we'll make sure underneath the transmission spot, we have it set to black, which it is. Very good. And now, for our diffuse, this should start coming through. Now, I'm not particularly sure why we're still getting color on this. I don't think it's because, it's because I didn't have the value dragged right. Now we're looking at the diffuse. Now we're looking at the pure diffuse value here. And this is what I did for my bump. So this is actually my bump map, and I think I drug these a little bit. So here we go. We have our bump map here basically fueling some bump values on here. And I also plugged this into the bump on my my specular one down here too. So basically all I did is I took this image texture, plugged it into my gradient, and then through the gradient pinched that image texture through black and white values just to create some variation in that to create a type of bump map. And you can see it does a pretty decent job. It just was me trying to add a little bit more detail, and you can kind of go here and there and do that. So then once you have that set up, all I can do is simply take this diffuse, plug that into there, and boom. Now we have a little bit of bump kind of going on, fueling a little bit more detail. It's not that much, not like we need much because it's such a high definition mesh, but again, it was kind of a workaround that I did. On top of that, I also copied the image texture and then plugged that into the transmission slot. The reason for this is I wanted the diffuse area, even though it's technically diffuse, right? It's not transparent. Most fruits, even in the more rindy parts of it, even the more woody parts here, still have some type of light going through it, and that adds so much realism for food. Like, I can't even stress that enough. Subsurface scattering really benefits and helps foods out. Very, very much so. So that is what I did. I used this image texture here through the transmission slot and used that to fuel kind of the look of the rind that we had here on the pineapple. So that brought a lot of life back through it. Whoops, I'm going to do Control-Shift-Z to back up my camera, and that is why I add the transmission value there, because I still wanted some subsurface scattering. Now, the reason that I just copied the diffuse is the default value of 1 is not bright enough for what I wanted, so I upped my value to 1.5, and I upped my gamma to brighten it out. That's a really good trick, because if I pull it back, it makes it too white, just too bright. You can see what we're doing here. If I had a gamma 2.2, it has too many white spots, too many hot spots. What I want to do is just kind of even the overall brightness of it out. So I just kind of darkened everything down with a gamma value of 3, and then I punched the value of everything up more to 1.5, just so we can have a more even kind of brightness of it coming through. So that is a way you can kind of easily rework just a raw diffuse image as a transmission image, just kind of bring a little bit more life to it. I pump the gamma up to force the dark values kind of down and pull the white points back, and then take the whole thing and just boost it a little bit more brighter. And you can control the entire value of your transmission through here. You could say, okay, we're going to have none, or we're going to have a ton. We could crank this up to like 24, and now it's emitting tons of light through it. You can see we went way too high. So value of 3 is also too high, so 1.5 is quite nice. Now again, then we went down to our specular. Just go ahead and take a look at the raw specular. We'll hop into our mixed material, go to mixed materials, drag this to 0, and now we're looking at the raw specular of it. This is what adds a lot of realism and life to this. You can see that this does not look good at all for the rind, right? But it looks great for the actual flesh of the pineapple. Again, that looks great here, but if I switch this back to the diffuse, that just screams fake, right? That is horrible. It looked great for the rind, right? It looks great back here. Does not look good here. So it's the opposite. We need our specular for that part. It looks really good here, but not for the rind. So again, that's why I did the separation there. That's why for fruits and stuff like this, it's really important to make sure your materials kind of mix and blend correctly. It's all about coming up with that nice a hybrid for a lot of different foods and fruits and stuff that is needed, especially for like a pineapple slice like this here. You're going to want to do that. Even maybe possibly a tomato slice. The skin of the tomato is going to be different than the actual internal meat of the potato. Or sorry, tomato. Potatoes as well. They're probably a little different than that. A potato is actually a little bit more dense on the interior than a tomato would be, though. So again, different texturing workflows for every type of food you're working for would most likely be what would happen. But anyway, back on topic. This is the specular material that we have here, and the way I set this up for our specular is I simply have this image texture fueling our roughness. It's plugging into something else here. I believe if I switch this from a specular to a diffuse, I have it plugged into the diffuse value. I was mixing two different diffuses together when I was demoing this. Did not work. I'm trying to think back like 2 years ago, and that's what I remember doing. We'll go back to the specular now. But all we have in here is we have a float here, just controlling my roughness. You don't have to use this float. For me, I just liked using a float because it was easy just to grab it and do it instead of click here and then go to roughness. So again, up to you to decide on that, but I just set my roughness to like 0.4, nothing too crazy. And I think on my diffuse, I didn't even use any roughness. No, my diffuses, I don't usually use roughness on because they're already relatively pretty rough as it is. So 0.4 on roughness, that was important to make it not look too shiny. And then, of course, we have the bump from the gradient, which is made from the same image map we have up here. Now this image texture here, I have my gamma pulled down. I wanted it a little whiter. I had it purposely intended for that. I played around with it, and I wanted to pull the brightness of it and pull the white points up a little bit more. It just looked better for the specular. And what I did is I ran this into two things. I ran it into the transmission, and I ran it into a scattering medium. Now I ran it into a transmission because this is the overall color of our object, like the kind of light that's scattered through it. What's it look like? So I put that into our transmission, but then I also wanted some absorption, right? I also wanted it to kind of absorb down and get darker, and that is why I threw in to a scattering medium. So I threw that into the absorption, added some density of 5, and my volume step length has no effect. It doesn't matter what you do here. This is only if you're using like volumetric fog volumes or something. Then those step lengths work. Otherwise, this means nothing. So I just set it to default of 0.5 just because it kind of looks good. It just kind of a nice round number there. Or it's not really a round number. It's an uneven number, but halfway to 10 or halfway to 1. So that's usually what I like to set it for some reason. And then for my scattering, I just let this to a value of 1 because the scattering was a huge component in this. Because right now it looks, if I set to 0, it looks almost like, it looks very nice and pretty, but almost like a jello or something, right? Like, it depends. Like the water is just more clear. Like I don't know, I wouldn't particularly, it looks good but not particularly what I was after. But with a value of 0.5, it just allows more of that light to get kind of scattered off of it. It makes it look more dense, and that is what I wanted to go for. So definitely I wanted some scattering there, some little light scattering going on. Control Shift Z to kind of do that every time I zoom in too far. So that is why I did that. Now here is a big thing. I actually have a duplicate of a light here. We'll remove that. I actually then took an RGB spectrum, plugged that into a texture emission, and then plugged that into the emission node here. The reason I did this is because for some reason, when I was playing around with this, it did not look like I wanted it to look. It looked way too dead and dark. It didn't look like enough light was scattering through it and coming out the other side. That's just an intense calculation to have more light go into it and scatter back out. And you usually can compensate that by putting more harsh lights on it. But there's just so much work involved with like intensifying the lights, but then it affects your scene, and then you have to somehow dial the lights back over here, but put more lights in the part that you can't see so it can bounce more light through and out of the fruit to make the fruit look more lifelike and brighter. What I simply did is just took a texture emission node, threw this on here, and it's a value of 0.6 now. If I disable this, look at this. Oh my goodness, this is horrible. It looks very dead, right? Because we absorbed our color down so much. And this is based off of our scattering medium, which has an absorption of 10. Now, if I pull our absorption back, oh good, problem solved, right? Now we don't have any more issues. I'm going to save real quick with Control S. You can see, okay, great, we don't have any more issues with that looking so dark. It's still not perfect, don't get me wrong. But it's better. But again, I want it to absorb down. I want it to absorb down darker. I want to have some darker points because that's like what would happen in real life. But I also want more light scattering through this and giving it more life. And that is the biggest thing. I can't stress this enough. With food, it's all about light and subsurface scattering. It's all about light coming through the food, because a lot of things that we eat, especially anything that has liquids in it, has tons of subsurface scattering all through it. And our texture emission node, our light source, having this at a value of 0.6, really brings this to life, as you can see here. Like, this helps tremendously. The reason for this is because my RGB spectrum node is set to basically just pure white light, and this is basically enhancing the absorption light that we have going into it and our transmission. This adds a lot of life to this. This basically fakes light coming in and bouncing back out. So instead of me trying to do all the complex calculations, right, of upping my scattering and bouncing and rebalance all these things out, right, trying to get light to bounce in it and then come back, I simply will just artificially fake it by making a light bulb out of it and emitting light out. Now again, this goes a little bit, goes a long way. We don't want to go too much. If I go to my amount here and drag this up to, like, say 5, now it literally looks like a light. This does not look very appetizing at all. Not something you'd want to eat. It looks like it's emitting light. It looks very cool, but that's not what we're after. So a little bit goes a long way. We're not trying to make it look like it's emitting light. We're trying to make it look like a bunch of light is bouncing off of it and through it. We want to really make sure it looks like a bunch of light is subsurface scattering its way through it, like there's tons of stuff going on. So this is a really great way of fixing that. Now, the reason that this is actually happening like this is because with a particular realistic pineapple, there is a bunch of little meaty pineapple pieces inside of it, and this is just me guessing. But because it's normally much denser than I would make it, the subsurface scattering and the absorption would actually kind of bottom off. You'd have like layers. You have like liquid surrounding different other layers of the pineapple, and it's reflective because the liquid kind of escapes it. And then you have like a reflective layer, and then some of the juices absorb down, but it doesn't go too dark because it's not necessarily like a solid clear way all the way through. Like this is just basically a hollow shell, so we don't have the actual detailed, truly atomically, what is the anatomy of a pineapple slice set up here that would give us those proper results that look like this, right? So that's why we're faking it. Instead of going through all the work of creating like a layer of pineapple inside of it where we have like maybe a layer on top that really lets the light come in and absorb, but then a more diffuse layer on the bottom so it doesn't absorb too hard and then let the light bounce back out. Instead of doing all that work, that's really complicated and a pain, because right now the light is just absorbing down into nothing, but we still want the absorption, right? We want the absorption for color to give it like a density like it would. Instead of doing all the work, though, coming up with the anatomy of a pineapple, we can simply just have it emit some of its own light back out, and boom, problem solved. So having just a simple light emission node into something like this helps a ton, especially for more liquid-based fruits like watermelon, a chopped strawberry, any type of fruit that you would cut in half for the actual meat of the fruit. This helps a ton, brings some life back into it. And light is usually what you perceive as life into these fruits and stuff. When something is really just like really, it doesn't have much light to it, like really, really dark, like this, that does not look appetizing. That looks like it died or it's rotted or something like that, right? So we want to add some life to it. We'll put this back to 0.6, and now it looks like it has some really good kind of life to this. So that is a big little trick I learned there. I was really, really happy with how it turned out. Can't tell you how many hours I spent experimenting with this and just trying different values, trying to get that to work. But with that out of the way, we have basically covered this entire process of me texturing this. So we also, again, have our transmission. I will show you what that looks like really quick. This is with the absorption medium off, and you can see that we're just transmission value just going right through it, getting some nice colors and stuff, some of that light just absorbing into it, which is very important, because if I take our medium here, plug that in and unplug our transmission, the transmission is a huge value here because it actually forces the colors to stay consistent. The light that's emitted through it is being affected by that transmission. I'm going to do Control Z to undo that. The light that's going through it's being affected by that transmission. The subsurface scattering, the light that's going through it's being affected, the light that's being emitted out of it, including our texture emission node, is being affected by that, so it doesn't give us this pure white light that we were seeing there. Like, it fixes all of those issues for us. So having some transmission value is also important, because you need to understand, is this liquid all this color and then absorbing down, or is this liquid mostly water with a liquid that kind of more condenses? For example, imagine you made a glass of lemonade, clear water, right? And you just dump the packet in. And then only towards the center or the bottom did it really absorb down into that color. So in that case, I wouldn't really use transmission. I would just simply use absorption. So it only gets denser as it goes in thicker. Or you might have a really well mixed lemonade that's just super thick, where the whole thing all the way through is that color. So then you would use transmission and then some absorption on top of that, because you would have the lemonade everywhere with that color, and then you would further go in more and more. And it's all about adjusting your transmission value based off of how much of the actual regular color is right out of the gate. So you always start, okay, what's our base color in this transparent object that we're looking at, right? What's our base color for the standard usual area for it? So we'd say, okay, maybe like a little yellow, like this is our typical lemonade, and then anything that's really absorbed in more, we could then come up with an absorbed level of that. So that's usually how I like to work. First, decide what is the average color of the whole thing I want it to be, and say like a nice lemonade like this, and then come up with my absorption. I'd say, okay, well, when it absorbs down, then it looks like this. And probably not that much, so like something like this, right? This is more absorbed. And then for the less absorbed part of the lemonade, it'd be more like this, just like the average thing would look like that. So that's a little tip there. That's how I usually like to work. And for this is no different. We're just coming up with that based off of this image texture with the gamma pulled down to 1.8 just to brighten it up. So we have our generalized look of the pineapple, and then we can have some absorbed color fight down more. So you can see here on the tips of the pineapple, this goes a long way with having the absorption because we're whiter here on the tips. But as we move into the center of the pineapple, it gets more dense. Again, adding more lifelike realism to it. So the transmission value keeps that constant pineapple color throughout it, but we also absorb down with even a harder, more dense color as we move into the center. And then, of course, we have that light being emitted from our black body texture emission node here that just really brings the life to this fruit and just actually makes the light, it looks like more light is subsurface scattering and bouncing through it and off of it than really would be, because those calculations would be a pain in the butt to get that set up. So the beauty of 3D is we can fake things like that. So that helped us out a ton. Now, with this one moved out of the way, let's just go ahead and move straight on to the orange slice, because that was another one that I was pretty proud of. I spent a lot of time on the orange slice, and the good news is the orange slice is made up almost exactly like I did the pineapple. Before we move on, actually, I should probably fix the pineapple because I forgot to plug back in. You can see the rind looks horrible because it's still running off of that subsurface scattering. Let's plug our invert node back into here. Boom. Beautiful diffuse, followed by the beautiful specular material. Nice little combo mixed together. Looks very, very good. So let's go back over here, focus on our nice orange slice that we have here. Now the orange slice, I'm just going to go ahead and actually turn on my geo instances because I have a really nice prop right here, this camera angle. Now I haven't talked about them yet, but I also have 5 cameras. These represent the 5 different shots I did for this scene. This was shot 1, which represents this shot here, the whole everything. Then we have shot 2, that represents this shot here. And then you can see then we have shot 3. And this one I don't have an actual picture for. I never actually rendered this one out, but it was just different things I was experimenting with. It turned out really good, actually. I probably should have rendered this. It turned out really good. I really love how the light is hitting this pineapple here. Now again, the bump map for the pineapple, it had a lot to do with that too. And before we move on, I do want to lightly mention, let's go back to our node editor over here for the full mix. For our specular, I did set my index to a value of 1.45. So the reason I did this is quite honestly because I didn't understand proper index values. This was like over 2 years ago. That or I just missed it. But proper index value for water should be 1.333. So that probably would have been a little bit better. Or I could have done like a glass at 1.56. I might have just wanted it more reflective, so I might have just done 1.45 just to force those reflections up. That's probably what I did, to be honest, because 1.45 is a pretty safe bet. But either way, more realistic would have been a 1.33, because that is the index of water, and that's what we'd be seeing on this pineapple in reflections. So that is this beautiful level of highlights we're getting off the surface. That said, 1.45 did add a little bit more pop. And the details they're actually seeing in this fruit here, a lot of those bumps and divots and just variation on the top of it, is purely based off of the mesh. I'm not going to lie to you there. I didn't do some massive, impressive texturing work there. I mean, if you look at the mesh here, look how much detail is on this scan. It is beautiful. But again, what we did is when we went through and textured out the node like this and did all that work, setting up the light and stuff coming from this, that enhanced the actual shape and look. So a lot of those details and the realism of this comes from actually the mesh itself, but the real key of life it came from was getting the reflections and highlights to actually be physically correct and actually getting the light to kind of come from our texture emission node. Because again, that same angle wouldn't look good at all if we didn't have this light emission from it. Yeah, you can see there we're getting some issues. So again, it's kind of a hybrid thing. It's working with your mesh and working with your materials. It's kind of both ways there. And this really does look good. And again, that's why we wanted the specular material here with that subsurface scattering going through, and the scattering really helps a lot too, because if I didn't have any scattering here, it doesn't quite hit it quite as well. It just seems too bright, almost like it's not that dense, almost like it's a jello. It's very borderline with a good looking fruit and something that looks like a gummy, so it's really tricky with that. So I'm going to set our float back to 1, and for me with the scattering at 1, just really it really cemented in, no, this is not a gummy, this is a piece of fruit. So that's why I really wanted to go with that. With that out of the way, you can see again the reflections hit this really nice. And if I would set this for our mixed material back to the diffuse, really want to show that off, we lose those reflections, right? Again, dead and ugly looking, not good. We need those reflections, and that is really what fueled what was it, shot 3? Yeah, shot 3. Look how dead that looks with a diffuse. And no matter how much work I'd put into a diffuse material, it is not going to get reflections like a specular material would. And I could have used a glossy, but again, it would be dead but with reflections on top. That would not be what we need. We need that subsurface scattering. That's what gives life to food. So that is why when we actually have this, that looks so dang good. It is that subsurface scattering that we have running through it. Now, if I did not have our invert node here, our gradient running off to mix this, you can see this actually looks pretty good from this angle. We're not getting too many reflections. That said, I do prefer this on because we're just getting a little too much reflection here on the edge of the pineapple. It was kind of bumping into the point where you're like, it's looking like the whole thing is like a fruity thing, which it's not. The back of it is more of that woody texture here. It's more something similar to, like, I guess a bark or something like that would be on the back of a pineapple. So again, having that mix worked well. Just the detail of it being a proper 3D scan piece of fruit helped a lot in believability here. But again, having the proper index values for the reflections, the absorption coming through that, all of these things really go to giving life. Now, before I get too far off track, let's go ahead and talk about the cameras again. This is shot 4. There's that iconic shot of the orange slice right there. There it is. Very nice. And then we have shot 5. This is another shot I did not use, though it looks pretty nice. I think I probably should have rendered that out as well. But let's go ahead and talk about shot 4. This is that orange slice. Let's go ahead and talk about how did I texture this orange slice, right? How did I do that? Let's go ahead and hop down here. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. Now, for this orange slice, what I'm going to do is we have a lot of bloom going on in the background here, too. I'm going to go ahead, open my settings. I'm going to go to Post and disable the bloom. I love the bloom. It worked great for this render. It was exactly what I wanted for the shot, but it'll make it easier if I disable it. So let's go ahead and select our orange slice, and that is going to be underneath whole orange, slice orange. And this is just under a default mixed material setup. Nothing special on here, just like what was with the pineapple slice. We're going to have a diffuse, and we're going to have a specular, and we're going to mix them both together. So here's my mix. Now what I did special here is because an orange slice is just, it's all fruit, right? We don't have with an orange, we don't have like a rind or that the piece like the pineapple would have over here, right? This is just all one thing. So what I did with this is I actually mixed them together. It's a value of 0.3. So 0 is just the specular, and you can see that this is very liquid and gummy looking. And if I go to a value of 1, this is far too diffuse. This is horrible looking. It looks like fake plastic food. That screams not real looking. This here screams much more similar to a food, but at the same time a little too gummy. So we wanted a hybrid of both, and that turned out to be a value of 0.3 for me here. It pulled enough of that away, densened that fruit up a little bit, got a little bit of the reflections off of there, made it look a little bit more solid, but at the same time still a fruit, because a pineapple is not necessarily a clear gummy. It's still got some diffuse kind of mass into it. The anatomy of an orange slice I'm not exactly sure of. But again, there's a lot of little elements into that. Next time you eat an orange, take a look at the slices. There's tons of little membranes and stuff here full of clear little transparent elements, and then more dense little elements and little membrane, these little white pieces here, like these little membranes that run through it. Tons and tons of stuff involved with it. So that's why I mixed the diffuse with the speculars, because I wanted to incorporate some of that diffuse element that would be part of an orange slice. And that was, again, by adding a little bit. Now, I'm only using a tiny bit. We're only using a little bit of that diffuse. We're way over here only at 0.3. So that means majority of this is, so technically, we're using 70% of the specular material and 30% of the diffuse material. So again, we're using just a little bit of it, but it really did help. You can see this is with it, the proper mixture, and this is with it, just the specular. This really just really comes too strong through here. It looks good, like, don't get me wrong, much better than pure diffuse. By all means, it does not look good at all. But when we add just a little bit of it, just a touch, because pure specular just does not work out too well. It looks good, but not quite what I was after. So a value of 0.3 darkened it down just enough to make it look a little bit more believable. That said, though, this is artistically up to you. For me, that's what I wanted. I could pull this back to 0.2, maybe even 0.1, etc. Play around with that, experiment. But for me, 0.3 was a great mixture. And again, you don't have to use a mixed material. Use an Octane blend material. Use an Octane blend material diffuse with an Octane blend material specular. Highly encourage that. Don't use an Octane mix material like I did here. This is only because I had to. Trust me, I would have loved to have been using an Octane blend material back then. But now that we have basically this figured out, let's go ahead and just take a look what I did to texture my Octane diffuse material. All I did here, again, I just came with a raw mesh with a diffuse material, nothing special. So that is why I'm dealing with only that simple diffuse matte there. So because we didn't have any fancy normal maps or fancy bump maps stuff, I had to kind of make my own. So what I did is I took this image texture for the diffuse, copied it, and ran this into the transmission value. And I actually dropped it down because it was so darn bright. And I really wanted to compensate for that because a value of 1 just blew it out too much. It does look good, but it was just too bright. It looked fake, in my opinion. It looked cool. It looked good. It looked visually interesting, but at the same time, it looked too much. Like, look at this orange slice in the back. It literally looked like too much was going on. So that's why I darkened that down to 0.3, because I didn't want that much coming through. I didn't want that much light. Now, on top of that, we also have our bump map, and our bump is being driven by literally all I did. Instead of running it through a gradient, I cheaped out on this because it worked well enough for me. So I took a copy of the diffuse image, switched its type to float, so it would basically turn Octane to interpret it as black and white. If I did normal, it would just interpret it as a normal map, or not normal map. It would just interpret it as just a colored image with color data. It's not updating here, but this is what it would look like. But the float is what I wanted because that would only interpret it as a black and white map, which is the only thing that a bump map can read. So it saves a little bit on VRAM, makes everything run a little bit faster, a little bit more efficient. That's the only reason I did that. And I just fed that color in there. Now this worked out perfectly because if I zoom in here, I might be able to make this bigger for you, is that with the albedo map, we basically have the orange kind of color in the back with these really strongly white membranes that stick out. This worked out perfectly because sadly with our mesh, the membrane lines don't show up too well. I mean, they are so thin, no 3D scanner would really be able to pull that out perfectly. I mean, unless it was like something a little bit higher. I mean, it can get a little, but the bump map helps so much by just really punching a little bit more oomph on those white spots or these white little membranes here. And that worked out perfectly for me by just creating some distinction between the little white membranes and the orange. So I really wanted to make the membranes kind of punch through, and that gave just some detail overall in the orange, because you can see right here, let's zoom in real close. You can see if we get a little bit of a zoom here, you can see this is not going to look good because it's so close, but I just want to make a point here, is if I unplug or I'll just not unplug, I'll just drop my power to 0. We'll drop the power to 0. You can see we lose a lot of that detail here, right? Like, look how flat and bland this looks. Like, see, the bump really did bring that to life. I'm just going to go ahead, pull that over, and you can see we're getting the roughness, we're getting it similar, but a ton of detail is lost on the surface of this orange. And if I put my bump back to a value of 1, instantly, look at all these little veins and stuff on the orange, night and day, just flat out night and day difference. Like, we're getting a real nice definition on like these little orange, what are they called? Little veins, or the little orange membranes. That's it, the little membrane in the orange. So again, bump helped out a lot from that, and just simply a bump map generated from the image map here, the color map, helped out a ton, because a lot of times a lot of the detail in that color map can be pulled over as a bump map and made a lot of detail out of that, like these little white veins that we had in the orange diffuse here could be turned over to a bump to really make these pop out, and that really helped bring some life to this. So definitely play around and experiment. Even if you don't get a bump map with your images, try and use that diffuse map. You can plug that diffuse map into the bump map and run a gradient through it and kind of pinch and alter the things like we did with the pineapple slice. Play around with that. That can help you out drastically. Again, with the oranges, I did the same thing like I did with the pineapple. Threw a black body emission in here and just brightened up. For this here, I just cheaped out and just didn't even plug in an RGB spectrum. I just used a flat out value of 4. If I drop this to 0, you can see it's just it's too dark. It's just not bright enough. It just does not look right. If I set this to 4, boom, brightens everything up a little bit, brings some life to it. Now, you don't want to go too high. Again, if I set this to like 50, then becomes a flashlight. Not what we want, right? So we can drop this to 10. Still too bright. Look at this background one here. Very fake looking. Drop it down to 4. There we go. Nice and beautiful. Looks very tasty and inviting, like something you'd want to eat. Definitely looks alive and healthy. Now, if we have that set up there, I also did my typical absorption. Here's our absorption and our transmission. We have a transmission value there. And our absorption, I set to a value of 0.7. If I up this too high, it'll absorb down too dark, not what we want. If we set it too low, the light goes through it without any absorption. And with something like a fruit and an orange, it definitely would get less light traveling through it as the light goes through because it is a denser piece of fruit. So as light goes through, it would get absorbed. So adding some absorption is key to adding some realism too. So that's why I've added a value for this particular case of 0.7 looked good. Because as light travels through this, this isn't a hollow piece of clear fruit. This isn't supposed to look like a lemonade drink or something that's perfectly transparent all the way through. Even lemonade would have some absorption. So that's why we definitely wanted to have some density added to it to really make it look like it was a solid piece of fruit. That said, not so solid where it looks like it's some default plastic rock, right? We still want light to scatter through it. And that's why we also added a little bit of black body emission to help that out a little bit. Help give some life back to it by making it look, faking the look of light scattering through it. Because why do all the work of trying to get more light to scatter through this thing and mess around with different scattering and roughness and density values when we can simply just set those up to look good on the surface and then just slap on a black body emission and just emit some light back out through it, and boom, that completes the process there. Anyway, why do all the work of trying to force more light into it to bounce back out when we can just skip the middleman and go straight to just bouncing the light back out of it? So quick little handy trick there. I was really happy when I figured that out, and that's a really big thing that I will recommend all day long, is adding like some type of light emission to your fruit. It's really counterintuitive. It's not something you'd expect, but it really does go a long way, especially for making food look something like you'd want to eat, because that's the hardest thing with CG renders, is food just looks, getting food to look real and like something you'd want to eat is very tricky, because it constantly can look fake and dead, especially without subsurface scattering. It can look like plastic, essentially. So getting that nice subsurface scattering light going through it really is a key thing, especially for CG renders. And in painting too, in painting and any type of art, any type of good looking fruit and food always has like a nice looking food and subsurface scattering type of light going through it look, because that's just a natural trait of the food that we eat. It tends to be anything, even like a French fry or a piece of bread, has super porous shapes to it where light just scatters through it. It's just very interesting when you think about it. But for a diffuse element, that was that there. I had literally no roughness set for that. For my orange slice, I did have manual roughness set here with this float, 0.1. Again, a lot of the detail from this came with a mixing of our specular material right here with our diffuse material with a value of 0.3, and a lot of the detail, these membranes here, came from simply a bump map that I plugged into both my diffuse and both my specular, and that was based off of the image diffuse texture that I got when I got this free orange slice. So again, we can really rework some amazing bump maps from a standard diffuse map. So always keep your eye open for contrast and details in your diffuse map, seeing if you could pull that detail out and how that would look, because again, this helped night and day. Again, let's take one more look at that. This is without. See how just flat and bland and lifeless that looks. Just does not have the detail like it did before, even as a 3D scan with this much detail thrown into it, right? Like, this is definitely not a low-res 3D scan, because you can see here, if we do N plus B, this is a lot of freaking polygons. Probably about 500,000 just this tiny little slice. But if we throw this bump map back on it right here, instantly take a look at that. We get some light, we get the light and the reflections hitting these beautiful little details. These veins pop out and look really distinct for us as they grab and catch your eye. The bump itself is actually going to add some roughness to it in itself, because roughness is basically light being bent and warped as it comes through. So this bump is going to help warp and bend and kind of roughen up the light as it's traveling through, and just create some definition, because again, the membranes on a real orange slice are more rough than say the actual meat of the orange. So we're creating these different distinctions in the different areas of the fruit here. All this organic variation is kind of coming through, and this shows off great because we're basing this entire variation in bump off of an image texture that was generated from a real world piece of orange. So if we can use that original diffuse 3D scanned image to fuel our bump, the better it's going to look, because that's really going to give some nice organic nature to it. But again, been rambling on quite a while on that, so now we're just going to go ahead and finish up by talking about the solid pieces. We've been talking about the more advanced pieces, the pieces here. For the solid pieces, like with the nice orange, like we've been talking about the advanced slices here, like the actual the part of the pineapple you would eat, the nice little meaty part of the pineapple here, and then the orange slices and stuff. Now let's just go ahead and quickly talk about just the regular pineapple pieces. This looks really good here. I love how this turned out, the full pineapple slice. The reason this looks so good, though, is there really wasn't much work involved with it. What I did end up doing, though, is add some diffuse subsurface scattering. Now, again, this isn't a liquid, right? This is a more dense piece of fruit. It's just the leaves are so thin and stuff that light was able to get through here. So I do have some transmission values involved. So let's go ahead and take a look at, if I go to our whole pineapple under this tab here, we can go ahead and select it, go to our node editor. Now this is simply a diffuse material. There is nothing else involved. A plain, ordinary diffuse material. I have my diffuse plugged into the diffuse, but what I have done to this to bring life to it, because this is the default, right? Here's our default pineapple slice. Or an entire pineapple. It's okay, right? It's pretty cool looking, but it could be better. And what I did is I copied my diffuse, selected it, and upped my power to 3. And I took this copy of the diffuse that has a higher value to 3, so it's brighter. See how much brighter this is opposed to this? And plugged that into transmission. When I did that, this is allowing light to be scattered through the object. This is essentially adding subsurface scattering to our diffuse material, allowing light to go through it. And the higher I up this value, the more light and the brighter that light is that bounces through it. If I up this all the way to 34, you can see that a ton of light is bounced through it, and a lot of the energy of the light that hits it is being redirected back out. Or in fact, in this case, I think we're intensifying. We're turning it into essentially a light bouncing light bulb, right? So we could have like tons of transmission. The light is just bouncing through this thing like crazy. Not very realistic though, right? But a value of 3, this brings some life to it. This really makes it look like the light that's scattering through this is really good. Now, there's a big difference, though, let me say, between transmission and actually like the orange slice we did here. Let's go back to this pineapple slice here. We actually used a texture emission. This light is its own essential light. I could disable the light in the scene, and it would still emit light. So let's go ahead and do that right now. That is the catch, the cliche, or I don't know if cliche matches there, the catch to using this. If I disable our Octane Sky, let's go ahead and hide it. This is still going to get lit. Now the background for my scene here is actually set to a default. So if I go over here, I go over to settings, or what do I go? Yeah, I go to settings, I go to environment, set this to black so we don't have anything else in the background there. That should hide it for us. And we're going to have to refresh our render, resend it to re-grab that data. It should only take a second. Now it is going to take a little bit of time. Because we do have some very high resolution geometry. I forget how many millions of polygons we have in here. At 3 gigs, my guess is around something like maybe 10 million triangles, something like that. But anyway, here we go. Nothing lighting our scene, but then you can see clearly that these pieces of fruit and stuff are getting their own light. Notice that the pineapple is not. The pineapple is not getting its own light because transmission is simply subsurface scattering. It's the rebouncing of light that enters into it. It's not the generation of its own light. The texture emission node, like here, where it's a light emitting node plugged into the emission slot, is actually generating its own light. Now I did that again because it was just a whole lot easier to fake rebouncing the light out than generating our own light and bouncing it out, than trying to brighten up the light that was bouncing into it. A really good, again, hack and little quick fix for that type of look there. For the pineapple, though, we didn't really have much of a problem with getting the brightness on there because we didn't need to do any absorption. There wasn't any need to add absorption to our pineapple. It just simply, there's really not much light bouncing through it anyway. It's a pretty solid element. There's no specular material needed or involved here. And it was simply just the light bouncing through it a little bit. So that's why we don't see that. Now, if you were going to do a low light render of these things, they'd have to be reworked. You'd have to turn down the brightness on these. And that can easily be done just by selecting the material, go to the texture emission, and dropping it down. Maybe a value of 0.1. Or in this case, maybe 0 if you want it to be really dark. But again, these are going to have to be altered based off of that. So that is a drawback. They're not 100% physically accurate in that sense. So that does kind of come down to that. That said, it gives you such beautiful results when you actually do have it in a properly lit environment. So if I turn this back on, you can see this just looks beautiful. Instead of constantly having to fight and pull back and forth your transmission value, it's just better. Because if I take this here, pull this down, and trying to get this back with my transmission, take my transmission value and up this to say 50, then you can see the light. It just blows it out, right? Then we're going too far into the white. So instead, what we can do is we can just take our transmission, that sets the color, and then just have the light itself brighten it up. And that is just a whole lot better of a fix than trying to up the power of our transmission by increasing that there or dropping our absorption to allow more through. It's just a pain. So this is, in the end, my opinion, best way of achieving this result. But anyway, back onto our pineapple. Got a little distracted. Pineapple looks beautiful, right? 3 million polygons do give a nice little bit of detail to this guy right here. And this looks super, super good if we go back to our whole pineapple. Back over to here again, all that life is simply coming through our transmission value here. The subsurface scattering rebounce of light that is entering into it. And man, oh man. Even areas that aren't the leaves, because the leaves benefit the most from it. Look how much the light just kind of shines right through this. It looks so good. I just really love how that looks. Disable that. Dead, lifeless plastic, right? Not what we want. Transmission to it, boom. Edible, realistic, that looks like real fruit, that looks good. Now, even for the body of the pineapple, something that's so dense you wouldn't naturally assume subsurface scattering would be affecting, it still does. If I unplug this, dead, lifeless, again, plastic. But if I add some subsurface scattering, boom, the light is actually able to bounce through it. And in real life, this still would have some subsurface scattering involved. Light would be able to get in here and bounce through the plant. It wouldn't be some solid piece of cement that light can't bounce through, right? This is a organic piece of food that's very porous, lots of holes in it, and light would be able to bounce around and get through that. So again, transmission, cannot stress this enough. So any types of subsurface scattering, absorption, refraction, and bouncing of light is all key in creating realistic looking foods, especially in fruits. And this does not change at all either with our orange. So our orange is set up almost to the T exactly like the pineapple. If I go over to our whole orange here, I can go to our mix, and our orange is actually slightly different. I'm going to correct myself on that. It is not just to the T like my pineapple. Why is this? This is actually because an orange is a little bit different. A pineapple is pretty rough looking, right? A pineapple is not very reflective, so I definitely don't need any like subsurface scattering, I don't need a specular material on it, right? Not like the slices. The slices had to have a specular material because they were, again, they had liquid on them. So we needed that nice kind of liquidy look for the reflection and stuff of the pineapple. If I go over to shot 3, it'll show it off again. Again, this is very kind of like it's wet. There's liquid. We just cut this slice open. So again, that would show up there. And that gives like that detail. We can see the bump map and the displacement showing up really good for this wood grain here. And you can see that that really gives some life to our pineapple slice here. But again, for the full pineapple slice, that's not a question anymore. We don't need that because there wouldn't be any liquid. This would be a very diffuse rough. There is no specular material involved here. The only subsurface scattering you get is the light that's kind of reflecting through this more dense, kind of porous type of woody material. So there still is some absorption, right? More like the absorption you'd get, or not absorption, more like the subsurface scattering you'd get on bread. Because bread is going to have some transmission involved, some subsurface scattering, but it would be more of a diffuse subsurface scattering, not necessarily a reflective, liquid-based absorption, not like something you'd get on a specular material. Now, for our oranges, on the other hand, an orange is going to have something that's going to be a little bit, whoops, see if I can control my camera a little bit more here. An orange is going to be, let me tell you, it's very dense, like my goodness. Extremely dense. We're going to do N+A to kind of zoom that out. The orange slice, which is gorgeous looking, by the way, is going to have a little bit of reflection. All oranges have a much more reflective exterior to them. They have like this kind of, I must want to say it's like a waxy coating sometimes, maybe. I don't really know what it is. But the outside of the orange has some like protective coating. Now, it is more of a diffuse base under that, but there's always like this reflective kind of layer on top. So the orange appears almost glossy, and that is exactly what I did. I have a glossy layer for my orange underneath my mixed material node. So we can see we have a mixed material node with, over here on the top, this is our diffuse material, followed by a glossy material. And this is just simply mixed together. So if I pull this with a float node, pull this to 0, this is just our pure glossy. It's way too much. No orange is that shiny. But if I set this to 1, then it looks dead. Now, there's a reason I have a diffuse material on here, though. The reason I did that is because I have transmission plugged in. If I unplug our transmission, our orange looks fake. Our orange does not look realistic. It looks dead. And if I go ahead and pull back, I forget what value I had. What was it, like 0.3 or something? Yeah, if I pull our float shader back, then this is allowing some of those reflections to come through. And if I pull it back to 0, now we're getting our reflections. The problem is this is not bringing enough life to this orange. It needs to be more than just reflective. It needs to have some type of transmission. It needs to have light to bounce through it and absorb through it, just like with the pineapple in the background. We need that subsurface scattering. We need transmission. We need light to be able to bounce through it, at least a little bit, to make it look believable. Because this isn't a solid block, right? This isn't a piece of cement. This is an orange slice. There's small little porous holes all the way through it that allow light to bounce through it. So we have to understand what we're trying to texture to when we're setting this up, because we definitely want this to look editable. Because if it looks too dense without that subsurface scattering, that's what makes it look not editable. We see something like that, and we're like, wow, that looks really rough and dense and not like something I'd want to bite onto, because I think it would probably break my teeth. So that's why we want the light to come through it, because subsurface scattering naturally in our mind implies that it must be something that's softer or more porous and might be something that's editable. So we'll drop this to 0.3. And we'll add a little bit more reflections back, maybe 0.5, something there. I forget what the default was, but that'll work. And then let's go ahead and add our subsurface scattering back into transmission. My subsurface scattering is simply a copy of the default blank repository orange color map, the just default diffuse map. I copied it and then upped the power to 3. Now my default for the image texture for the diffuse, for both the diffuse and the glossy material, default albedo map is just nothing special. I have that running in diffuse for both of them. But for this one, I copied it, upped my power to 3, and then plugged it in. Now this is far too strong. We have far too much light shining through, so I'm going to pull this back to something like 0.3. And at 0.3, I think 0.3 is what I use. And we are getting a little bit of green here. That's just a side effect of the color from this coming through. It's like punching through so hard that the colors are kind of mixing. It's coming off a little bit green. This, of course, will clean up as the render goes on. You can see it's no longer green here. We're getting a little bit of green in the reflections and stuff, but that just makes it blend into the scene because it's getting some reflections from the other objects. That's also what the green is coming from. It's getting the green reflection from the pineapple in the background and other elements like that. Now, if we wanted, we could pull this even back further. Like if I drop this to 0, look here how much more dead and lifeless this looks. It looks pretty good because it has the reflections, but it's just not quite there. We're going to go ahead and grab a render region real quick. Let's compare this here. We have that. We'll just do compare, store render buffer, and now let's just drop this or bring this up to 0.3. And I'm thinking with a value of 0.3, it's going to take a little bit, but this is going to add, 0.3 might be too much, but once it starts churning through, you can see the fill on the shadow of this is night and day. Like, look how much more we're going from that to that. And as this fills through and gets more reflections, more life, it's going to look better and better. Now, Ken, a little bit goes a long way. This might be too much. We might want to drop this to 0.2. 0.2 is pretty nice. I don't know what value I use, but I think 0.2 is what I'd go with in this particular scene. Just adds a little bit of fill, a little bit of life to it. Let's disable our comparison. Grab our render region. Take a look at a really tiny area here. Let that really render quickly. And you can see that adds a lot of life to it, comparing that as opposed to none at all. Look how much darker that is. Much less life. So again, subsurface scattering, let that light shine through, let that light bounce around. Really does help a lot and bring some life to it. Alrighty, now that we understand that, let's just go ahead and finish everything up by hopping over here and talking about how I textured this knife, and then we're going to wrap everything up. Basically, all I did is, again, this is the default model. We've looked at the mesh of it and everything like that. All I did, if I go to no layer, it's going to be the handle and the blade. Let's go ahead and talk about the blade first. The blade is extremely simple. There's not much involved here at all. I didn't even use this multiply node or this this node here, this flow texture node either. All it literally is noise. It's a noise node. I used chips, the chips noise node, and then what I literally did, if we can get a good angle on it here, I should be able to get something right about here. Here we go. All I did for my noise node is chips with octaves of 16 and omega of 0.75, and a little bit of gamma I pulled around to get the contrast adjusted, and our contrast was also upped or upped, not upted, that's not a real word, but upped. It was upped to create a little bit more intensity in the gamma, to increase the contrast of that, and then our gamma was just kind of altering how that noise showed through the black and white points, just sliding that. And you can see here under my texture projection node, I use XYZ to UVW, and I stretched out the X and the Y and the Z, stretched all those different values to really give it a more vertical stretch on this knife, and that just gives kind of like this streaking pattern of the noise to give the blade kind of the look that I was after. Really not too much going on with this. This is using a glossy material because the Octane metallic material did not exist back then, nor did the universal material. So I had to use a glossy material with an index set to 7. So it made it look very metallic-y and metal-y. It could have been a value of 1, but then I found that was just too strong. I wanted something 7, not quite so purely reflective, something a little bit of that base coat still showing through a little bit. For my base coat, I just did pure black because I didn't really want any colors being mixed in with this. Now that we understand that, that's literally all that was going on. I also had some roughness, which I just set to 0.05. Really not much roughness at all. Really not much at all on there. It's just simply the bump driving a little bit of that variation. And that's what I used for the handle here as well. Nothing super special going on. Or sorry, not the handle. I use that for the little metal element of the handle here. So kind of on the handle. Now for the actual grip portion here, this is, again, simple noise. Let's just go grab the handle here. Take a look at this. This is also another glossy material. We can go over here, check it out. It is a glossy with an index of 1.45. This is a little bit more less reflective. It's just a regular 1.45 index. I'm trying to simulate a type of leather or maybe a rubber that's on here. I was thinking more of a leathery type of look. All I did was I took a noise, used circular noise, octaves of 10, dragged that omega up again, play with my gamma here to increase and decrease the contrast. If I go too much this way, it's just far too much of that showing through. And if I go the opposite direction, we flatten it all off to basically a perfect white or black, and then we lose a bunch of detail. So a gamma adjustment was necessary to kind of just adjust the blacks and white points in that, and then the contrast up just to bring in a little bit more detail. And then on top of that, I threw all of this, and my texture projection for it is just XYZ to UVW, so it's infinitely tileable, but I left a lock aspect ratio on it, so it was evenly normal noise, no stretching, not like for the blade. And I did take a float texture, plug that into a multiply so I get to increase or decrease the strength of this noise through that multiply. So if I drop this to 0, you'll see we'll completely lose every little bit of noise that we have pronounced here, completely gone. If I up this to 1, you can see it's almost completely unlegible. And if I up it to 50, then you can finally see we're getting some. Now a value of 10 might show up. Yep, value of 10 just barely. For me, I settled up on a value of 40. So by timesing this value of 40 on the multiply node, it made it bright enough and strong enough where it actually showed through. So that's how we adjusted the strength of that noise there, which gave a very good result, in my opinion, for the blade of the knife. Gave a really nice handle, very nice details, very nice kind of just some detailed wear and tear that would just show up in the knife. The noise is just such a high resolution element that you can add for textures that it really does a really good freaking job. And you can really zoom in on here and you can see that this is 100% procedural, and there is the little circular dots that are ending up showing up way at the base of it. But from a distance, boy, does it pull off a really good pattern. And this just really did a great job of getting some life to this handle here. And you can see in this shot here, it's very small in the distance here. We could take a look at our finished shot, and you can see at this particular little nick here, the little variation we had in that noise really gave some realism to it, in my opinion. You can also see in this shot here, or not, this shot doesn't show up. It doesn't show up in that shot either, really, actually. I think the only other shots it would show up in is possibly that one over the slice here. Here we go. It'll probably show up decently well here, right at the angle. Looks really good. But again, that's really all that was involved in this scene. So at this point, this video, long as it is finally done. Thank you so much for watching this. I want to say really appreciate you watching all the way through. If you have, this was an extremely long video, so I really hope you got some good info out of this. And let me know if you're interested in more project breakdown videos in the future. The main reason I really wanted to do project breakdown videos too, that I wanted to mention, is simply because when you're dealing with this much content in a scene with this much advanced texturing and all this stuff, it just takes so long to do this. Like, this scene took me over 8 hours to fully set up. from the beginning to end easily back when I first made it. So there's just so much involved with experimenting and testing that to make this from beginning to end would just be way too long in any other video. Like we're at an hour and a half now almost, and this just being a breakdown video. So very, very lengthy to make bigger scenes, that's for sure. So I was hoping that by doing breakdowns, we could cover more advanced, bigger projects with Octane, but not take so long, because there's just flat out no way I could have done this in a reasonable amount of time from the beginning to end. Like, it would just taken too long, hand placing all these little elements and stuff like that. It just would have taken too long. As a quick little bonus to wrap everything up, I do want to talk about how I quickly hand place element stuff and things like that, like these fruits here in the scene. What I'll literally do is I'll go to my snapping settings and I'll enable them, and then I'll enable polygon snap. And if I do that, I can drag this around and it will snap to the polygon on the floor there. Now it's snapping through it because I have vertex snap enabled. I do not want that, so I disabled it there. Now you can see it's snapping to the floor perfectly. And I'll literally just drag this around and just say, yeah, somewhere around here maybe. And then I'll do Shift plus S to disable the snapping, and then I'll just lift it up until it's no longer clipping. That said, if you have actually the base point for your object set up correctly, you won't have any clipping at all. Like for this pineapple slice here, for example, I think... No, that's not set up correctly. One of these objects, here we go, this big pineapple chunk, has the actual base of it. It's object axis set at the base. So this one here, I could drag around, and you can see, if I Shift plus S, boom, beautiful, perfect snapping on our floor, rotates around and very easily placed. So that's a little bonus there. Shift S again, disable it, you can do more free-form movement. So at this point, though, this video is over. There's really not too much more left. The only thing I will mention is, because this is a really key element, I can't believe I haven't talked about yet, is finally the lighting. How did I light my scene? And the reason I haven't talked about that yet is because it's unbelievably simple. All I did was use an Octane sky object with an HDRI tag expression on it. So it's simply, if you go to Objects, an HDRI environment. Now with this HDRI environment, I use a Grayscale Gorilla HDRI, part of the Grayscale Gorilla HDRI pack, and I upped the brightness to 1.3. The reason I did this is a value of 1 just felt a little too dark. I wanted a little bit more brightness, so I upped it to 1.3. I wanted a really bright scene, and then I simply just rotated our HDRI until it felt like the light was coming from a good spot. What I ended up settling on is I really wanted this kind of high contrast scene. If we go to our final render, the light very bright on the left, coming in, it's shiny, it's bright, and it's rotating over to the right. The reason this is in America, in EU, and a lot of other countries, we read from left to right, starting at the top and working into the bottom right, and that type of mindset is driven even into our art. So basically, when we look at art, our eyes naturally usually tend to go to the top left and work to the bottom right. We just kind of have like this kind of pulling viewing sense almost, like we just look at it, we just flow from left to right. That's just kind of naturally ingrained to us. Now that might be different based off of countries, because different countries have different things. Like I know in Japan, they will read from right to left. In China, I think they read from right to left. So it will depend on culture. But again, it comes down to my particular art style, what I wanted to go for. I wanted this really warm center, kind of warmth over here, flowing off to a more cool shadow over here. So again, it's really bringing a level of like art and design kind of bring into this. A good level of composition, that's the word I'm looking for. A level of composition kind of in your scene here that just really kind of fills and cleans everything up. So that is why I rotated the HDRI that way. I think you'll agree that it looks better this way than if I rotate the HDRI and just have it like front right behind, just shining on like this. Like this just looks horrible, right? Scene was not set up for that. And you'll notice our materials don't look very good either. So I set my materials and stuff, my lighting was set up first, and then I got everything to kind of texture and work correctly from there. You can see these hot points are way too strong for a material here. It's way too strong, like, or too dark. It just does not look good. We don't have enough light scattering through it. It must be viewed from this angle, and then it looks great, so with the light kind of hitting from behind it. So it was all set up with that intention. So I'm going to reset the lighting, redirect it. We'll look at from the proper angle again. You can see everything is much better. Thank you again so much for watching this video. I really do hope you found it helpful. And again, leave comments in the description below if you're interested in seeing more videos like this. And before I leave, I do this a lot, but I did use HDRI Link to connect that HDRI. It's a free HDRI, or not a free HDRI. It's from the Grayscale Gorilla HDRI pack. I really love their HDRIs. It was really great. This one's called Creative Office EXR. So if you have the Commercial locations HDRI pack from Grayscale Gorilla. That is the one I'm using, the Creative Office. Very great HDRI, and I just use HDRI link to find it in commercial location. Scrolled through here and selected that Creative Office. That's this one here. And then just link that up to this and loaded it in. So that's all I did, and that gave us that beautiful lighting. And of course, I went to my post-processing settings and enabled a little bit of bloom. As far as render and compositing, all I did for final output was under Octane render passes. Literally nothing was done except for enabling a post pass for my beauty, and that's it. Yeah, that's literally all I did. I rendered out my beauty and I added a post layer and color corrected everything in Photoshop. So I just composited that on top. I used brought in the post layer, brought in the diffuse layer or the regular beauty layer, and then I took the post layer, put it on top of the beauty layer, and then just did that to an add multiply. Or linear add dodge, I believe it's called in Photoshop, and that just added them together. And then with those both added on top of each other, I color corrected in Photoshop, so then we had the nice bloom, and we had them separated. We can control them. I highly recommend when you export it out to not have your post effect baked on top. It's always nice to have that separate under a separate layer for compositing purposes later. At this point, though, I think I've covered everything. This video was a little bit more rambly with me talking on, but I kind of wanted it to be a little bit more relaxed. It's just me kind of just going through and showing you what I had in my scene. Again, thank you so much for watching. I truly do hope you found this helpful, and I cannot wait to see you all in the next video.